There is a lake at the top of a mountain, not a puddle, not a seasonal meltwater pool. An actual lake, several kilometers across, sitting in a glacially carved basin at an elevation where the air is thin enough to make walking uphill unpleasant, and where the temperatures drop below freezing for a significant portion of the year. It is surrounded by bare rock and sparse alpine vegetation. The nearest river system is hundreds of meters below, connected to this lake by nothing more than a steep, dramatic, entirely unswimmable waterfall, and there are fish in it. Not one or two fish that someone can explain away as an oddity or an accident. Fish, a population of fish, living, reproducing, maintaining themselves in this isolated body of cold water that has no apparent connection to any body of water they could have swum up from. How did they get there? This is one of those questions that sounds simple, almost embarrassingly simple, but the answer turns out to involve geological time, evolutionary biology, the physics of ice, birds with specific eating habits, the behavior of ancient humans who were carrying things up mountains for reasons that made complete sense at the time, and at least one mechanism that is so counterintuitive that most people, when they hear it, immediately want to argue against it before the evidence is explained. The fish in the mountain lake did not swim there. The mountain lake did not come to the fish. Something else happened across a range of mechanisms so varied and so interesting that the actual answer to this question is considerably more entertaining than the simple framing suggests. Start with the geological baseline, because some mountain lake fish got there the old-fashioned way. The mountain used to not be a mountain, or the lake used to be connected to lower water systems, or the fish got there when the geography was fundamentally different from what it is now. Mountains are not permanent features of the landscape on geological timescales. They rise through tectonic processes over millions of years. And the lakes that form in them, carved by glaciers formed by tectonic activity, created by lava flows, form in basins that were once at lower elevations or that were once connected to lower water systems before the landscape was reshaped by the same forces that built the mountains. Lake Titicaca, at approximately 3,800 meters elevation on the Andean Plateau, contains fish species including the giant Titicaca water frog, an animal so strange it looks like it was designed by a committee, alongside multiple fish species that are related to species in Amazonian river systems. These species are there because Lake Titicaca was once at a lower elevation and was connected, through ancient river systems that have since been disrupted by ongoing Andean uplift, to the lowland fish communities of the Amazon basin. The fish were there before the mountains were as high as they are now. The mountains rose around them. This is called vicariance, the isolation of a previously connected population by a geological or geographical change. The fish did not travel to the mountain lake. The mountain lake traveled to an elevation that isolated the fish already present in the water body. Given enough time and enough elevation change, this mechanism can place fish populations in locations that look completely inaccessible from any angle of modern geography. The specific fish that end up in mountain lakes through vicariance are often highly endemic, found nowhere else on Earth, because their isolation has lasted long enough that they have diverged evolutionarily from their ancestral populations. Lake Titicaca's fish fauna contains multiple species and subspecies found nowhere outside the lake, products of the evolutionary diversification that millions of years of isolation produces. Ancient humans living near high-elevation lakes containing vicariant fish populations were interacting with what were, in evolutionary terms, some of the most isolated and most evolutionarily distinct fish populations on Earth without any knowledge that those fish were there because the ground beneath them had been rising for millions of years. Now address the ice mechanism, because this one is the most physically counterintuitive and the most fun to explain. During glacial periods, and there have been many of them across the Pleistocene epoch, the geological period that covers most of ancient human existence, glaciers covered enormous areas of mountain terrain. These glaciers were not static. They moved. They flowed downslope over thousands of years, carrying enormous loads of rock, sediment, and, critically, anything that was in the water they incorporated. When a glacier moves across a lake or river, it can incorporate water including the fish present in that water into the ice mass. Fish eggs are particularly susceptible to this incorporation. Fish eggs are small, relatively robust to freezing under specific conditions, and are present in huge numbers in the shallow areas of lakes and rivers where glacier water interaction is most intense. The glacier then moves. Over years and decades, it carries the incorporated material, including potentially viable fish eggs frozen within the ice, across the landscape. When the glacier melts, either seasonally at its margins or terminally when climate warming reduces its mass, the material it has been carrying is deposited wherever the ice happens to be when melting occurs. If the glacier has moved upslope, or if its terminal moraine is at a higher elevation than its origin, material from lower elevation water systems can be deposited at higher elevations. Fish eggs deposited in meltwater pools that eventually develop into permanent lakes, through ongoing glacial meltwater input, through rainfall collection, through the geological containment of a glacially carved basin, can establish populations in those lakes if conditions are adequate for hatching and development. The specific conditions required for fish eggs to survive glacial transport are not trivial. Temperature, oxygen availability, and physical protection from grinding within the ice all affect egg viability. Not every egg transport attempt succeeds. But across the enormous timescales and enormous spatial scales of glacial activity during the Pleistocene, the number of egg transport attempts was vast, and the cumulative probability of successful establishment in some fraction of those attempts is sufficient to explain the presence of fish in lakes where no other mechanism is obviously applicable. Ancient humans living in mountain environments during or immediately following glacial periods were inhabiting landscapes that had been recently reshaped by exactly these processes. Landscapes where the distribution of water bodies and the fish populations within them were the fresh products of glacial dynamics that had concluded within the ecological memory of the ecosystem, if not within the cultural memory of the human communities. Address birds because birds are responsible for fish in mountain lakes more often than seems physically possible, and the specific mechanisms are both well documented and genuinely strange. Water birds, herons, ospreys, eagles, kingfishers, ducks, grebes, regularly carry fish and fish eggs from one water body to another, primarily through mechanisms that the birds have no awareness of and no intention of executing. The most studied mechanism involves fish eggs adhering to waterbird plumage and feet. Fish eggs in the shallow margins of lakes and rivers are often sticky. The adhesive coating that helps them attach to substrate also helps them attach to the feet and leg feathers of birds wading in those margins. A bird that wades in a lake containing fish, then flies to another lake, and then wades again, can transfer viable eggs between water bodies. The survival rate of eggs through this transfer depends on flight duration, temperature, and egg desiccation resistance. But experiments have confirmed that eggs of multiple species can survive transfers of several hours' duration, more than sufficient for a bird to fly from a lowland water body to a mountain lake. Ducks are particularly effective vectors for this mechanism because they not only wade but dive, ensuring contact between their plumage and bottom sediments where fish eggs are concentrated, and because their waterfowl plumage traps water that can maintain egg viability during flight. A single duck leaving a fish-containing lake can carry dozens to hundreds of viable eggs on its body, depositing them in the next water body it enters. The second bird mechanism involves fish carried in the digestive system. This sounds immediately implausible because fish in a bird's digestive system are being digested. But some fish eggs consumed by birds survive gut passage and remain viable when excreted. This has been demonstrated experimentally for specific egg types with hard shells or resistant coatings, and the number of eggs consumed by water birds feeding in fish-rich environments ensures that even a low survival rate through gut passage produces meaningful numbers of potentially viable eggs in excrement deposits. Water birds also directly carry fish. An osprey or eagle that catches a fish and then loses it, or that is mobbed by another bird and drops its catch, deposits live fish into whatever water body happens to be below the loss point. Mountain lakes that are on the flight paths of fishing raptors are therefore periodically receiving live fish from lower elevations. The probability that any specific drop results in fish surviving and establishing a population is low. Across decades and centuries of raptor activity, the cumulative probability becomes significant. The water connection mechanism deserves examination next, because many mountain lakes that appear completely isolated actually have seasonal or periodic surface connections to other water bodies that are not visible to casual observation. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Snowmelt and heavy rainfall events create temporary surface water connections between normally isolated water bodies that can last from hours to weeks. During these connection periods, fish can move between bodies of water that are completely separate under normal conditions. A fish population in a lake at one elevation, connected by a temporary meltwater channel to a higher lake during spring snowmelt, can colonize the higher lake through active swimming upstream during that window of opportunity. The fish species most likely to colonize mountain lakes through this mechanism are the species with the strongest motivation for upstream movement. The salmonids, whose anadromous members evolved the specific physiological and behavioral drive to move upstream that makes them capable of ascending steep gradients and navigating temporary channels that other species would not attempt. Ancient humans in mountain environments were well acquainted with this mechanism, even without understanding it mechanistically. The specific seasonal appearance of fish in high-elevation streams and pools following snowmelt, a phenomenon that any attentive observer of mountain hydrology would notice, was probably integrated into the ecological knowledge of ancient mountain communities as a predictable seasonal event with specific practical implications for food acquisition. The ancient person who knew that a specific high mountain pool contained fish in the weeks following the spring snowmelt and who planned seasonal movements to coincide with this availability, was working with accurate ecological knowledge derived from sustained observation of a pattern that has a specific physical explanation. Now address the ancient human mechanism directly, because this is the one that is both most directly relevant to the channel's content and most definitively documented in the historical record. Ancient humans carried fish to mountain lakes, deliberately. This is documented in sufficient historical and archaeological contexts to be beyond reasonable dispute. And the motivations behind these translocations were varied, specific, and in each case completely rational given the circumstances and knowledge of the people involved. The most extensively documented ancient human fish introductions to mountain lakes involved salmonids, trout primarily, and occurred across multiple mountain systems on multiple continents. The specific evidence varies by location. Historical records in some cases, isotopic analysis of fish populations showing discontinuities consistent with introduction events in others, genetic analysis revealing the presence of lowland genetic lineages in isolated mountain lake populations in others. The motivations for carrying fish up mountains were straightforward from the perspective of the people doing it. Mountain lakes represented food resources in otherwise challenging environments. A mountain lake with a viable trout population was a lake that could provide protein to people traveling through or living in high-elevation terrain where other food resources were limited, and hunting required considerable effort. Stocking mountain lakes was an investment in future food security along travel routes and in areas of seasonal or permanent occupation. The specific logistical challenge of getting live fish from lowland waters to high-elevation lakes was not trivial, but was manageable with ancient technology. Fish could be carried in containers of water, hide bags, wooden containers, clay vessels, with the understanding that the fish needed to arrive alive, which constrained travel speed and required attention to water temperature and oxygen levels. Fish eggs packed in wet moss or other moisture-retaining material could survive transport conditions that adult fish could not. Young fish from spawning areas, small enough to be carried in quantity in portable containers, were more transportable than adults. Ancient humans who regularly traveled mountain routes had extensive practical knowledge of which routes were feasible for live fish transport, which water sources along the route allowed container replenishment, which travel times were achievable before fish mortality would occur, which seasons provided water temperatures suitable for keeping transported fish viable. This was specialized knowledge built from the same empirical observation and practical testing that produced all ancient ecological knowledge. The hunting and gathering dimension of ancient human fish transport requires specific attention because the standard narrative of ancient peoples as purely responsive to their environment misses the active ecological management that ancient communities regularly engaged in. Ancient humans in some ecological contexts were managing their food resource environments with a sophistication that modern conservation biology has only recently begun to appreciate. The evidence for active ancient management of fish resources, beyond simple harvesting, includes the translocation evidence already discussed, but extends to other forms of active management whose traces are visible in the archaeological and environmental record. Ancient human communities along river systems in the Pacific Northwest of North America maintained sophisticated knowledge of salmon population dynamics and implemented specific management practices. Managed harvesting intensity, selective removal of specific size and sex classes, maintenance of critical habitat features that modern fisheries management independently determined were optimal practices. These communities were not managing fish populations because they understood the mathematical model of sustainable yield fisheries management. They were managing them because they had observed, across generations of sustained engagement with specific fish populations, what harvesting practices maintained population viability and what practices degraded it. Ancient communities in mountain environments who introduced fish to high-elevation lakes were extending this same management logic to productive water bodies that lacked fish populations. A fishless mountain lake was, from the perspective of an ecologically sophisticated ancient community, an underutilized resource. Water, space, and probably adequate food in the form of invertebrate communities that could be converted into a productive protein resource through the investment of transport effort. The decision to introduce fish to a mountain lake was an investment decision with a long-time horizon. The fish introduced in one generation would not be available for harvest until subsequent seasons or years. The community making this investment was thinking across a time horizon that extended beyond immediate return, which is itself evidence of the sophisticated ecological planning that ancient communities engaged in. Here is a mechanism that receives almost no discussion in popular treatments of this topic, but that is biologically documented and fascinating: tornadoes and waterspouts. Strong rotational wind phenomena, waterspouts over lakes and rivers, tornadoes moving across water surfaces can lift water, and the organisms within it carry those organisms in the air column for distances ranging from hundreds of meters to several kilometers, and deposit them when the atmospheric conditions change. This has been documented in the modern period through accounts of raining fish, events in which small fish fall from the sky onto terrestrial areas far from any water body, having been lifted from a water surface by a waterspout, and carried until the wind event dissipated. Fish transported in this manner do not survive in large numbers. The atmospheric exposure, the mechanical stress of being lifted and moved in an air column, and the impact of landing are all significant mortality sources. But the mechanism does not require high survival rates to be evolutionarily relevant. It requires only that some fraction of transported fish or eggs survive and land in a viable water body, which mountain lakes are when reached from downslope source water bodies. Ancient humans who witnessed fish falling from the sky, which was a documented phenomenon that multiple cultures incorporated into their cosmological frameworks as a remarkable natural event, were observing the most dramatic version of the aerial fish transport mechanism. The specific accounts in ancient oral traditions of fish appearing in high places after storms probably reflect real observed events, even when the cultural interpretation of those events embedded them in frameworks that modern biology would not endorse. The significance of this mechanism for understanding fish distribution in mountain lakes is not that it is common. It is rare by definition. Its significance is that it demonstrates the completeness of the suite of mechanisms available for fish colonization of isolated water bodies. Every mechanism that could plausibly move fish upslope, geological change, glacial transport, bird vectors, human introduction, atmospheric transport, has been demonstrated to work in at least some contexts. The actual fish in actual mountain lakes represent the cumulative outcomes of all of these mechanisms operating across the full timescale of those lakes' existence. The ecological consequences of fish introduction to mountain lakes whether by ancient humans or by any other mechanism, deserve examination because the arrival of fish in a previously fishless lake produces dramatic and specific changes to the entire lake ecosystem. Mountain lakes that have no fish contain specific ecological communities built around the absence of fish predation. Zooplankton populations, the tiny aquatic invertebrates that are the primary food source for small fish, reach densities and develop behavioral patterns that reflect their evolution in the absence of visual predators. Aquatic insect larvae, including the larvae of the mayflies, stoneflies, and caddisflies that are the primary invertebrate food of trout, are abundant and active in the daylight hours that fish predators would make dangerous. The introduction of trout to a previously fishless mountain lake triggers what ecologists call a trophic cascade, a series of interconnected effects that propagates through the food web from the point of introduction. Trout consume zooplankton directly and compete with zooplankton for algae. Trout consume aquatic insect larvae. Trout consume amphibian larvae, the tadpoles and salamander larvae that occupy the same shallow productive margins of mountain lakes that fish habitat requires. The specific vulnerability of mountain frog and salamander populations to fish introduction has been extensively documented. Multiple high-elevation amphibian species that declined dramatically in the 20th century have been identified as declining specifically in lakes that received fish introductions, while recovering in lakes that never received fish or from which fish have been removed. The ancient human fish introductions to mountain lakes were not ecologically neutral events. They were transformations of lake ecosystems that persisted indefinitely once established. Ancient humans who introduced fish to mountain lakes were probably aware that the introduction changed the lake. The fish they subsequently harvested from introduced lakes were evidence that the introduction worked, but the broader ecological consequences for non-target species would have been below the level of observation or concern given the knowledge frameworks of the time. Here is the full picture of how fish actually end up in mountain lakes. Some arrived before the mountains did, through vicarians, isolated in water bodies that were carried to high elevation by the same geological forces that built the mountains over millions of years. Some were carried by glaciers during the Pleistocene, their eggs frozen into ice masses that transported them from lower elevation water bodies to high basins where they were deposited as the glaciers melted. Some were transported by water birds whose feet, feathers, and digestive systems served as vectors for fish eggs moving between water bodies along migration routes that crossed elevation gradients. Some colonized through temporary hydrological connections during snowmelt events that briefly linked otherwise isolated water bodies. Some were carried there deliberately by ancient humans, who recognized fishless mountain lakes as underutilized food resources worth the logistical investment of stocking them. Some arrived via the most dramatic route, falling from the sky after atmospheric lift events that nobody witnessed because the event occurred far from any human observer. The mountain lake with fish in it is the product of whichever subset of these mechanisms was applicable to its specific geography, geology, elevation, and history. Multiple mechanisms can apply to the same lake sequentially across its existence. A fish population established through glacial transport during the Pleistocene might have been augmented by bird-vectored introductions during the Holocene, and then supplemented by ancient human introductions during the period of human occupation of the surrounding landscape. Ancient humans who fished mountain lakes and who thought carefully about those lakes and their fish. As ancient peoples who depended on specific food resources for survival tended to do, were confronting the same question that opens this video without the benefit of any of the explanatory frameworks described above. They knew the fish were there. They knew how to catch them. What they made of the question of how the fish had arrived in a lake that had no apparent connection to lower water bodies was probably embedded in whatever cosmological framework their community used to explain the remarkable features of the natural world. Some of those explanations were probably more accurate than others. None of them would have predicted the glacial transport mechanism, or the bird-egg adhesion mechanism, or the trophic cascade consequences of fish introduction. But the practical ecological knowledge that mountain lakes could contain fish, that those fish were worth the effort of reaching, that stocking new lakes was a worthwhile investment of effort, was accurate. practically useful, and reflected the genuine sophistication of ancient ecological understanding applied to the specific resources of mountain environments. The fish are in the mountain lake. The ancient human climbing toward it with a container of water and 2 live trout was not asking how fish ended up in other mountain lakes. They were making sure that this one had fish in it for the next person who came through. That is a reasonable priority.